campaign to subvert our election. There's a lot in there, but there's a discovery that no one's talking about. The striking similarities between what the Russians did and what the Trump campaign did. I'm going to go one-on-one with a Democratic senator on what comes next. Happy Monday night. Let's get after it. All right, now we see. This is it. Just came out a couple of hours ago. What is it? It's the 302 that the FBI took down after meeting with General Flynn back there in January of 2017. 302 is their written form of what happened in an interview. It's all here. People have been telling you that this was hidden. This was covered up because they didn't want people to know that Flynn was set up. Wrong. Over and over during this interview, you're going to see that the general lied about his discussions with the Russians. It's also important to point out what it is, what is not in here. Those of you who said, oh, you'll see, he was set up. BS. Remember, after this happened, the much maligned Strzok and McCabe, they didn't even think Flynn was lying. Mueller's investigators had to piece it over when they had seen more information later on. So you're going to have to find a new conspiracy. Let's talk facts with a former federal prosecutor who's been on the front lines of some very high-profile political cases. Jeff Tsai, it's very good to have you on Primetime. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Chris.
All right, you've had a chance to look through the 302. There are redactions. I don't find them as material as I've found the reductions from the Mueller people in the past. Other documents. What's your big takeaway?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that what the 302 tells us is that if you're going to talk, don't lie. It's something I have told my two daughters, Ella and Charlotte, year after year. And what we realize is that if you elect to talk to the government, it's important to tell the truth and tell the full truth.
All right. So Mueller had come to the conclusion that the general was committed to a lie. Here's the thing I don't get. Help me understand this from your perspective as a prosecutor. They ask him really leading questions in here. One of them, he thanks them for, right? Hey, thanks for reminding me about that. But when you hear an FBI agent talk about a conversation that you know you had, why would Flynn deny the same more than once?
Well, I think there are two important things to keep in mind. And the first of which is that the government always takes an approach in which, in these kinds of interviews, they start with the broad and they go narrow. So they tend to like to actually ask open-ended questions to give a person an opportunity to talk. So they try not to lead people to certain kinds of answers. But again, it goes back to the issue that if you're going to talk, that you then tell the truth. On the question that you're asking about prompting Mr. Flynn, General Flynn, to a specific topic, that's pretty common too, because often when you start with a broad topic, you want to go a little more narrow, especially as it relates to the specific subject matter that's at issue. And that's what I think was reflected here in prompting him to talk about certain of those topics related to sanctions, as well as the UN Security Council vote.
I totally get it. Very interesting for the audience. Even though I'm not an intel expert, it seemed pretty obvious to me what they were asking and what they were prompting about, but he didn't go with it. We have three interesting examples of these dynamics for the audience. The first one we'll put up right now. And this is where the FBI agents reminded the general, okay? The interviewing agents asked Flynn if he recalled any redaction with Kislyak about a United Nations vote surrounding the issue of Israeli settlements. Flynn quickly responded, yes, good reminder. Okay, so that shows everybody's on the same page. Hey, you don't remember talking about Kislyak? Oh, yeah. So he has to know that they know what he talked to Kislyak about. They may be phrasing it as a question, Jeff, but he now knows they know. What do you take away from that one?
Well, I think that's right. And I think that really goes to the issue of when someone elects to talk to the government, to an FBI agent, and makes the decision that he or she is not going to tell the truth, that what's happening there is a feeling that he or she can fool the agent. And I think that that's what people often forget when people are confronted, witnesses are confronted with the opportunity to talk to agents, and they're answering these questions, that for those who decide to talk and those who decide that they want to lie, they're trying to direct agents in a different way.
And it's interesting. Flynn, by all the notice that we heard last week, jocular, not nervous, not locked up, not defensive. Example number two, which is one of the two material false statements that he wound up making to the FBI agents that he wound up pleaded guilty to. So put up this one. All right. Flynn stated his calls were about asking where countries would stand on a vote, not any requests of, hey, if you do this, that he didn't do it that way. But again, they're asking him in the text of this, that wasn't the best excerpt, where they say, hey, do you remember talking to Kislyak about which way they might go on anything? I don't know why that didn't trigger in the general's mind. All right, they know. They know about this conversation. They're just asking these things. But he lies to them about that, and he then admits the same. What goes into that decision? You keep saying when people decide to lie, this is why they should know they're at risk. But what about that mindset of, all right, I'm going for it. I'm going to lie.
Well, some of it is that the feeling, I think, on some of these witnesses is that they think that if they give some kind of modulated answer, something that is both yes and no, or perhaps I don't remember, that'll give them the wiggle room to be able to get out of making a statement to the government or making a statement that they potentially can get out of later. What I think is probably the most material out of all of this is that there isn't a question as to whether or not General Flynn lied. This is something he admitted to. I think the question is that all of this has come about based on what Judge Sullivan has asked for, is whether or not there was something else involved in the interview that suggested that something else was at play in terms of the interview that happened. And
also, there becomes this looming question of who knew? Who did the general think that he was protecting by covering up what discussions he had? Whom was he in talk with? They talk a lot in this document, people will find fascinating, that he was in the Dominican Republic. They talk about the Dominican Republic like he's on Mars. His government BlackBerry didn't work. He couldn't get a phone call to stick. I've had okay time with comms on Dominican Republic during and after earthquakes and hurricanes. I don't understand why it was so hard for him. But again, it just goes to the whole spirit of confusion on this matter. And there were other calls made to Mar-a-Lago and to others while he was away and while he was in the mix of these conversations. That may wind up be revealing as well. I don't know that it has to do with the redactions here, but certainly that's another piece of the puzzle for Mueller to put together. While I have you, I don't want to waste your expertise. So here's the new argument from the president's counsel. John Edwards, my friends, we've already seen this situation play out in court. John Edwards, same situation as the president, and he was acquitted. So as we see, there is no crime. Your take?
Well, one of the things, probably the most important takeaway from the Edwards prosecution is maybe not necessarily the verdict and non-verdict, because remember, it was both an acquittal as well as a hung jury on the majority of those counts.
And the FEC didn't bring the case. They used that also. They say you had to bring the case. DOJ prosecutors, not the FEC. They didn't even think anything was wrong.
That's right. And the reality is the FEC is independent and operates separately from the Justice Department, and that's how it should be. And the FEC has civil authority, not criminal. That's a Justice Department power. One of the things I think that really is a takeaway from Edwards, however, as it relates to these set of facts that we're talking about, is one of the things that Judge Eagles ruled in the Edwards case related to this whole notion of what a contribution is under law. And as you've talked about before, it relates to this whole idea of what was the purpose behind the money itself that's at issue. And in the Edwards case, the question came up of whether or not the money that was, again, at issue in that case had to be the sole purpose or the primary purpose for influencing the campaign. And what the judge ruled in that particular case was that it didn't have to be the only purpose, the primary purpose. And that I think is probably the most significant point that arises out of that case that could have implication here.
You know what's so interesting is that the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, stated exactly the opposite yesterday as the outcome of the case. He said that case showed you it's got to be for the purposes of the campaign. If it's not about the campaign, that's what the case showed us. If you go and read the decision, the judge held the opposite.
That's right. And so the other issue that will come up is the precedential value of that particular ruling. As you know, a ruling from a particular federal district court doesn't necessarily have mandatory authority on any other district court judge. And so that's going to be hotly debated. And it's worth noting that the statute itself doesn't say one way or the other. So it's left for the prosecutors and the defense lawyers to debate amongst themselves. But it is, in fact, a very real issue and a material issue, because one of the things the judge talked about in the Edwards case is that it's very rare in human nature for people to just simply have exclusively one purpose
motivation.
in mind, one reason.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's just interesting that if you're going to use a case as your defense, you better get the holding right and not say the opposite of what the judge did. I don't know what they're banking on. I guess they're just banking on the fact that people will listen to what they say and do no homework. Jeffrey Tsai, this was really helpful. We're going to get more meat on the bones from Mueller and others. Please come back and help us make sense of it legally and in terms of what arguments are going to be made. Until then, the best for the holy days for you and your family. Thank you.
Happy holidays. Thank you, Chris.
You too. All right. We now know how Russian trolls came up with their novel social media strategy. We have the details of it in a new set of reports, what they did. But there's this new question that we're going to lay out for you. Why did Trump's campaign make similar moves? Next.